What is the stranger's secret/true mission? The medicine pouch never left Nia's possession, even in sleep. Jake had seen her check its contents daily, her expression revealing nothing but her vigilance speaking volumes. Whatever she carried was worth risking her life for, worth enduring Burke's camp and fleeing across Apache territory alone. More than once, he'd caught her studying the horizon to the north, her gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the mountains to something or someone waiting there. Dawn broke cold and silent over the Arizona territory, painting the Dragoon Mountains in shades of copper and gold. Jake Callahan had been awake for an hour already, stoking the dying embers in his cabin's stone fireplace. The April morning carried a bite that his 3 years in this harsh country hadn't softened. Outside, his breath clouded as he made his way to the barn, boots crunching on frost-stiffened ground. "Morning," he muttered to his mare as she nickered softly. The word emerged rough, unpracticed. Some days he spoke less than 10 words total. Today might be one of them. His cattle dog Scout circled his legs, eager for the day's work. Jake patted the animal's head absently, the closest thing to affection he permitted himself these days. The ranch chores followed their unchanging rhythm: feed the livestock, check the fences along the eastern pasture, inspect the spring for signs of the approaching dry season. Routine was what kept him moving forward, one foot after another, day after unchanging day. By midday, Jake noticed 2 calves missing from the south herd. Spring mountain lions, most likely. He saddled his horse, whistled for Scout, and rode toward the foothills where the beasts usually dragged their prey. Dark clouds were gathering over the mountains, threatening one of the sudden violent storms common to this season. The first calf he found easily enough, half-eaten behind a jumble of rocks. But searching for the second took him deeper into the rocky draws than he'd intended. The storm hit with startling ferocity, rain sheeting down in blinding torrents. Jake pulled his slicker tighter and was about to turn back when Scout's behavior changed. The dog grew alert, hackles raised, nose working the rain-soaked air. "What is it, boy?" Jake followed the dog's gaze toward a narrow ravine. That's when he saw it. A splash of something dark against the pale limestone, not animal blood, too deliberate in its pattern, like someone had been wounded and staggered along the rocks. The trail led toward a shallow cave formed by an overhanging ledge. Jake reached for the Winchester rifle slung across his saddle. Moving cautiously, he approached the cave entrance. Scout whined softly beside him. The rain had momentarily slackened, and in the gray light, Jake made out a crumpled form against the back wall, a human form. "Hello?" he called, voice scratching from disuse. No response. He moved closer, rifle ready. It was a woman. Her black hair hung in wet tangles around a face etched with exhaustion. The traditional dress marked her unmistakably as Apache. Blood had soaked through the fabric at her side, and her wrists bore raw marks of restraints. Beside her lay a small leather pouch, clutched even in unconsciousness. Jake swore under his breath. An injured Apache woman, clearly running from something or someone. The army patrols would hang him without trial if they found her under his roof. 3 years he'd spent building this place, carving a solitary existence from this unforgiving land, and taking in this woman threatened everything. As he stood deliberating, her eyelids fluttered. For a brief moment consciousness returned, and her dark eyes locked onto his with unmistakable terror, not of him, but of what pursued her. "Brother," she whispered, the word barely audible, before she slipped back into unconsciousness. Jake knew he should leave her. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed to walk away. But something deeper, something he thought had died with Sarah and Michael 3 years ago, wouldn't let him. He had buried his family on a cold Missouri morning, victims of the scarlet fever that swept through while he was away on a cattle drive. He hadn't been there when they needed him most. The thought of riding away, of leaving another human being to die alone, suddenly seemed impossible. "Damn it all," he muttered to Scout as he carefully lifted the woman. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, burning with fever against his chest despite the cold rain. "This is madness." He settled her carefully across his saddle and turned his horse toward home. Some choices, once made, could never be unmade. He'd just made one. The storm raged through the night, wind howling around the cabin's corners like a wounded animal. Inside, Jake worked by lantern light, tending to the unconscious woman laid out on his bed. Her skin burned beneath his fingers as he cleaned the knife wound on her side, deep but thankfully not infected. The bruises on her face and arms told their own story, as did the raw marks on her wrists where ropes had cut into flesh. 3 years since he'd touched another human being with any purpose other than the briefest handshake during supply runs to town. His hands felt clumsy, oversized as he worked, memories surfacing unbidden. Michael's small body burning with fever, Sarah's desperate eyes as he rode for the doctor too late. "Not again," he muttered, pressing a cool cloth to the Apache woman's forehead. "Not on my watch." She stirred occasionally, eyes moving beneath closed lids, words in her native tongue spilling out in fevered whispers. Once she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, eyes flying open but seeing nothing, before she collapsed back into delirium. By dawn, her fever had broken. Jake moved to the floor, back against the wall, rifle across his knees. He dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every small sound. Scout curled beside him, ears alert to the world outside. The woman woke silently. Jake sensed the change before he saw it. A shift in the air, the feeling of being watched. He opened his eyes to find her staring at him, gaze steady and calculating. She had pulled the blanket tight around herself, one hand hidden beneath it, likely gripping a weapon she'd found. "You're safe," Jake said, keeping his voice low and even. "No one knows you're here." She said nothing, eyes never leaving his face. "I found you in the foothills. You were hurt." He gestured to his side, mirroring the location of her wound. "I cleaned it. You had a fever." Still nothing. Jake sighed, rising slowly to his feet. "I'm going to make coffee." He moved deliberately to the kitchen area, feeling her eyes tracking his every movement. He had just set the pot to boil when Scout's ears pricked forward. A moment later, Jake heard it too, hoofbeats approaching. "Cavalry," he said, glancing at the woman. Fear flashed across her face, quickly masked. "Stay quiet." Moving swiftly, Jake lifted the trapdoor to the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, a space he'd built during troubles with cattle rustlers last year. The woman hesitated only briefly before slipping down into the darkness. Jake closed the door, sliding a rug over it just as a sharp knock sounded. 4 soldiers stood outside, led by a lieutenant with dust-caked boots and hard eyes. "Callahan," the officer nodded curtly. "Lieutenant Wilson, 5th Cavalry. We're searching for an escaped Apache woman. Dangerous insurgent. Killed 2 guards during her escape from the San Carlos camp 3 days ago." Jake leaned against the doorframe, face carefully blank. "Haven't seen anyone." "Mind if we look around?" Not really a question. Jake shrugged. "Help yourself." The soldiers searched efficiently, but not thoroughly enough to find the cellar beneath the kitchen. They asked about tracks near the foothills, about whether he'd heard anything unusual. Jake answered in his typical laconic manner, volunteering nothing. "If you see anything, report to Camp Grant immediately. the lieutenant said as they prepared to leave. "These Apache women can be as dangerous as the men. This one's connected to raids on settlements north of here." Jake nodded noncommittally. "I'll keep an eye out." After they'd ridden away, he waited several minutes before lifting the cellar door. The woman emerged like a shadow, moving with silent grace despite her injury. In her hand was a kitchen knife he kept stored below. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, the acknowledgement that she could have used that knife when he opened the door, but hadn't. "They're gone," Jake said simply. "I didn't tell them." She studied him for a long moment, then placed the knife on the table, not surrendering it completely, but signaling a tentative truce. Jake gestured to a chair. "You should sit. Your side needs changing." He indicated his own side again, then pantomimed wrapping a bandage. After a pause, she sat, watching warily as he gathered clean cloths and the whiskey he used for disinfecting. When he approached, she tensed but allowed him to inspect the wound. Jake worked silently, trying to be gentle, though his calloused hands were better suited to mending fences than flesh. "Thank you," she said suddenly, in accented but clear English, startling him so much he nearly dropped the bandage. Their eyes met again, and this time Jake saw something beyond fear and suspicion, a flicker of cautious gratitude. He nodded once, unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. The silence stretched between them, no longer hostile but uncertain, as the morning light slowly filled the cabin. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. For the first time in 3 years, Jake wasn't alone in his prison of solitude, and he had no idea what to do about it. That night, as she finally accepted the broth he'd made, he heard her whisper his name, Jake, having heard him talk to Scout. The sound of his name in another human voice after so long hit him like a physical blow, cracking something long frozen inside his chest. For 3 days, Jake and the Apache woman circled each other like wary animals sharing a den. She watched his every movement with dark, observant eyes that missed nothing. He found himself speaking more than he had in years, if only to break the silence, explaining his actions before making them, naming objects around the cabin, talking to Scout while she listened. "Beans," he said on the 4th morning, showing her the pot. "Coffee." He deliberately ate first from his plate before sliding hers across the table, a ritual they'd established to convince her the food wasn't poisoned. She nodded, watching him carefully before taking a cautious bite. "Beans," she repeated softly, the word precise on her tongue. Jake tried not to show his surprise at her use of English. He'd suspected she understood more than she let on, but this was the first time she'd spoken since that single "thank you" days earlier. After breakfast, he found her standing by the window, looking toward the garden he'd neglected since winter. She pointed to a plant with tiny white flowers growing wild at its edge. "Medicine," she said, "for pain." Jake approached slowly, looking where she indicated. That's just a weed." She shook her head firmly. "Medicine. Good for—" She touched her side where the wound was healing. Then she pointed to his shoulder, where he'd been unconsciously rubbing at an old war injury that ached in the damp spring weather. "Help this too." Later that day, to his surprise, Jake found himself applying a poultice of the crushed plant to his shoulder at her instruction. The persistent ache eased within hours. When he nodded his thanks, she offered the barest hint of a smile, gone so quickly he might have imagined it. On the 5th day, Jake was dusting the mantel when he accidentally knocked over a framed photograph. The glass shattered on the hearth. He froze, staring down at the faces now exposed. A woman with kind eyes holding a small boy with Jake's stubborn chin. His family, captured in their last autumn together. Before he could move, the Apache woman was beside him, kneeling to help gather the broken glass. Her fingers moved carefully, reverently around the photograph itself. When she looked up at Jake, her eyes held recognition of his loss. "Sarah," Jake said hoarsely, touching the woman's face in the photograph. "Michael." His son's name caught in his throat. She nodded, understanding. Then, pressing one hand to her chest, she spoke for the first time about herself. "Nia." Her voice was low, musical. "My name, Nia." That night, as Jake repaired a bridle by firelight, Nia sat cross-legged on the floor, sewing a tear in her dress with needle and thread he'd provided. The quiet had a different quality now. Not the dead silence of loneliness, but the comfortable quiet of shared space. "How you know English?" Jake asked finally. Nia's hands stilled briefly. "Mission school. Before." She gestured vaguely eastward. "Before soldiers come." Jake nodded, not pressing. He'd seen how the army dealt with the Apache, herding them onto barren reservations far from their traditional lands. San Carlos was the worst, a sun-scorched hell where different Apache bands were thrown together with inadequate food and shelter, disease spreading unchecked. The next morning, Jake took Nia outside for the first time since her arrival. Her strength was returning, though she still moved carefully to protect her healing side. He showed her the ranch, the small corral, the spring-fed creek, the vegetable garden he'd started and mostly abandoned. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert for danger. In the garden, she identified more plants with medicinal properties that Jake had been blindly pulling as weeds. She showed him how certain roots could be prepared for fever, others for infection. He found himself taking mental notes, impressed by her knowledge. As dusk approached, Jake demonstrated how to check his rifle, cleaning and loading it methodically. "Knowledge keeps you alive," he said, surprised to hear his father's words coming from his own mouth after so many years. Nia watched intently, then reached for the weapon. Jake hesitated only briefly before letting her hold it. Her hands moved with surprising familiarity over the metal. "My father teach hunting," she explained. "Before." That night, as they finished a simple supper, Jake spotted Scout growing alert at the door. A moment later, he heard it too, someone approaching on horseback. Nia was already moving toward the cellar when Jake stopped her with a raised hand. He recognized the distinctive gait of Thomas Blackwood's old mare. "Neighbor," he explained. "Not soldiers." Nevertheless, Nia slipped into the bedroom, out of sight, but not hidden, a compromise that showed growing trust. Jake opened the door before Thomas could knock, startling his nearest neighbor, a grizzled former prospector who lived 5 miles away. "Jake," Thomas nodded, removing his hat. "Saw your chimney smoke. Thought I'd check in, being as you rarely have a fire this time of year." Jake stepped aside to let the older man enter, hoping Nia would remain hidden. Thomas's sharp eyes took in the cabin. The 2 plates on the table, the mended dress hanging by the fire, a pair of small moccasins drying near the hearth. Before Thomas could comment, Scout suddenly growled, facing the window. Jake moved quickly to douse the lamp, peering into the darkness. In the faint moonlight, he caught the gleam of something metal on the ridge beyond his property. "Riders," he said quietly. "Armed." Nia appeared in the bedroom doorway, fear and determination mingled in her expression. "Burke," she said, her voice tight. "Bad man. He find me. He kill you, too." Thomas Blackwood's weathered face registered surprise at Nia's appearance, but to Jake's relief, no alarm or disgust. The old prospector merely nodded to her before turning his attention back to the window. "How many?" Thomas asked quietly. Can't tell. At least 3. Jake kept his voice steady, though his pulse had quickened. Been watching the place, I think. Thomas stroked his graying beard thoughtfully. Reckon we should find out who's taking such an interest in your hospitality, Jake. Jake grabbed his rifle, checking that it was loaded. He handed Thomas the shotgun from above the door. Stay with her, he told the older man. I'll circle around back. But before Jake could move, the riders had already approached the cabin. He counted 4 men on horseback, their leader a broad-shouldered figure with a military bearing despite his civilian clothes. Behind him rode 3 hard-faced men whose hands rested too casually near their holstered weapons. That's Randall Burke, Thomas whispered, recognition and distaste evident in his voice. Used to oversee San Carlos camp before he was discharged. Word is he's recruiting men to hunt down escaped insurgents, offering rewards. Jake glanced at Naya, who had pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her face a mask of controlled fear. Get to the cellar, he ordered quietly. Both of you. Like hell, Thomas muttered. I'm too old to hide from the likes of Burke. A heavy knock rattled the door. Jake took a deep breath, nodded to Nia, who slipped silently into the bedroom, then opened the door just wide enough to block the view inside. Evening, Burke said, his voice pleasant but his eyes cold and assessing. Randall Burke. I'm authorized by territorial authorities to apprehend escaped Apache prisoners. Mind if we ask you a few questions? Jake leaned against the door frame, deliberately casual. Kind of late for social calls. Burke's smile didn't reach his eyes. We've been tracking an escaped woman from San Carlos. Dangerous individual. Killed 2 guards during her escape. He paused, studying Jake's impassive face. Trail leads in this direction. Thought you might have seen something unusual in the past few days. Just the usual, Jake replied evenly. Coyotes. Mountain lion took one of my calves. Nothing else. Burke nodded, though his expression showed he wasn't convinced. Mind if we look around? Won't take but a minute. Actually, I do mind. Jake didn't move from the doorway. It's late, and I've got an early start tomorrow. Burke's eyes hardened. I have the authority to search any property. You'd need papers for that, Thomas interrupted, appearing beside Jake. Military or civilian authority. You got those papers, Burke? Burke's jaw tightened at the sight of Thomas. Blackwood. Didn't expect to find you here. Just being neighborly, Thomas replied evenly. Now, unless you've got proper papers, I suggest you and your men continue your hunt elsewhere. A tense silence followed. Jake kept his hand near his holstered revolver, aware of the 3 men behind Burke shifting restlessly on their horses. Finally, Burke's face relaxed into another cold smile. Of course, we'll be on our way. He tipped his hat. But I should mention, there's a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of escaped Apache prisoners. $500. Enough to buy a lot of new cattle. I'll keep that in mind, Jake said neutrally. As Burke turned his horse, he added casually, Oh, and Callahan. We'll be in the area for some time. If you do see anything unusual, you can find us camped by Cottonwood Creek. His eyes flicked meaningfully to the 2 plates visible on the table behind Jake. A man living alone should be careful out here, all sorts of dangers. The threat hung in the air as the 4 riders disappeared into the darkness. Jake closed the door, exhaling slowly. Thomas moved to the window, watching until the riders were well away from the cabin. Well, the older man said finally, you've surely stepped in it this time, Jake. Jake ran a hand through his hair. You know Burke? Know of him. Thomas spat into the fire. Brutal even by Army standards. was discharged for excessive methods at San Carlos, and that's saying something, considering what passes for acceptable there. Nia emerged from the bedroom, her face composed but her eyes haunted. "He will come back," she said quietly. "With more men." Thomas studied her with frank curiosity. "You're the one they're hunting, I take it?" She nodded once. "Did you kill those guards like he said?" "No." Her voice was firm. "Others escape same time. Fighting happen. I run." Thomas seemed satisfied with her answer. "Burke's not one to let go easy, especially if there's money involved." He turned to Jake. "And he's not operating on any official authority I know of. That reward he mentioned, that's his own doing." Jake moved to check that the rifle was loaded and ready. "Well, you should go, Thomas. No need for you to get involved in this." The older man snorted. "Bit late for that. Burke saw me here." He settled into a chair by the fire. "Besides, been a while since I had anything interesting happen. Gets lonely talking to rocks all day." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Jake found himself listening for hoofbeats, for any sign that Burke and his men had circled back. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain. The next morning, after Thomas had left with a promise to return with supplies, Jake discovered a crude warning carved into his corral post. A rough Apache symbol with a slash through it. Below it, in English, "Next time, we don't ask." Jake traced the carving with his fingers, anger rising in his chest, not just at the threat, but at the violation. This land, this small piece of Arizona territory, was supposed to be his refuge from the world and its conflicts. Now that world had found him anyway. When he showed the carving to Nia, her face hardened with resolve rather than fear. "I can go," she said quietly. "Tonight. Draw them away from here." Jake found himself shaking his head before she'd even finished speaking. "No." "Why?" she challenged. "Why risk for me? You not know me." It was a fair question, one Jake had asked himself repeatedly over the past week. Why risk everything for a stranger? Why defy men like Burke, who represented the authority he'd spent years carefully avoiding? "I know enough," he said finally, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I know Burke's the kind of man who hunts a wounded woman across miles of desert. I know what that says about him, and I know what walking away would say about me." Nia held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, a gesture of respect that meant more to Jake than he cared to admit. "Then we prepare," she said simply. Night fell softly over the ranch, stars appearing one by one in the vast Arizona sky. Jake and Nia sat on the cabin's small porch, the silence between them comfortable now rather than strained. In the week since Burke's visit, they had fallen into a cautious rhythm, working side by side during daylight hours, taking turns keeping watch at night. Nia had proven herself useful beyond Jake's expectations. Her knowledge of local plants had expanded their meals beyond his basic fare. Her keen eyes spotted game that even he had missed. Today, she had helped him mend fences along the eastern pasture, her small hands surprisingly strong and deft. "Why you live alone?" she asked suddenly, her English improving daily. "No family come after Sarah and Michael die?" Jake stared out at the darkening landscape. "Had a brother once. Lost him at Shiloh." The memory of Sam, forever 22, face down in Tennessee mud, still had the power to hollow him out. "Parents gone before that." "No one else?" Nia nodded, understanding in her silence. After a moment she spoke again. "You fought in war. Blue coat?" "Union, yes." "Then you come here. Why?" Jake had asked himself the same question many times over the past 3 years. Why Arizona territory, so far from everything familiar? Perhaps that had been the point. to find a place unmarked by memory, unshaped by loss. Needed somewhere different, he said finally. Somewhere I wouldn't see them around every corner. The night deepened around them. An owl called from the cottonwood by the creek. Scout raised his head alertly, then settled again by Jake's feet. "Your turn," Jake said. "Why were you at San Carlos? What happened to your people?" Naya's face tightened, but after a moment she reached for the small medicine pouch she kept always at her waist. From it, she withdrew a folded paper, carefully protected in oilskin. She handed it to Jake. "This why Burke hunt me. This why I run." Jake unfolded the paper carefully. It was a crudely drawn map, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. "What is it?" "Map to food caches," Naya explained. "Hidden supplies, seeds, dried meat, medicine. My people, Aravaipa Apache, hide these things before soldiers come, many places in mountains." Her finger traced the markings. "Without this, many die this winter." Jake studied the map with new understanding. "And Burke knows you have this?" Naya nodded grimly. "Burke sells supplies from camp. Government send food, blankets for Apache. He sell most to traders, keep money." Her eyes flashed with carefully controlled anger. "People starve. Children die. When he learn my father know where old caches are, he have soldiers kill him, take me to camp to make me tell." She pulled aside her hair to reveal a thin scar along her hairline. "He do this when I refuse." "Say next time, take ear, then I." Her voice remained steady, but Jake saw the slight tremor in her hands. 3 days later, fighting break out when more Apache brought to camp. Guards distracted. I run. The pieces fell into place. Burke's determination, his unofficial reward, his fear of being exposed. If what Naya said was true, Burke wasn't just hunting an escaped prisoner. He was silencing a witness. "My brother Keem, taken to northern camp," Nia continued. "Burke use him against me, say I never see him again unless I tell where caches are." She tucked the map carefully back into her pouch. "I must find Keem, must get map to my people." Jake leaned back against the porch post, weighing her words. It was a lot to believe from someone he barely knew, and yet he'd seen the brutality of the reservation system firsthand during his time with the Army after the war. He'd heard whispers of supplies meant for indigenous people finding their way to trading posts instead. "Why trust me with this?" he asked finally. "How do you know I won't turn you in for Burke's reward?" Naya's answer was simple. "You already choose. Day you find me in cave. You choose what kind of man you are." Her faith in his character struck Jake more deeply than he cared to admit. He'd spent 3 years running from who he'd been, who he'd failed to be for his family. Now, this woman, a stranger by any measure, saw something in him he wasn't sure existed anymore. "I need to show you something," he said abruptly, rising to his feet. Inside the cabin, Jake lit a lamp and moved to a trunk he kept locked beneath his bed. From it, he withdrew a wooden box containing papers and a few personal items saved from his life before Arizona. Among them was a folded letter, the paper yellowed with age. "After the war," he said, handing it to Nia, "I was stationed at Fort Bowie. We were ordered to pacify Apache bands near there." His mouth twisted on the word. "I saw things, did things I'm not proud of." Naya unfolded the letter carefully, though she couldn't read the English words. "That's my resignation from the Army," Jake explained. "I couldn't be part of it anymore. Couldn't square it with what I thought I was fighting for in the war." He took a deep breath. "The night before I submitted that letter, I helped a family, a man, woman, and 2 children, escape a planned raid on their camp. Never knew if they made it. He met Nia's eyes directly. That's why I left the army, why I came here, trying to, I don't know, start clean. Nia refolded the letter with careful precision. Not work, she observed quietly. You still carry. Jake couldn't argue with her assessment. 3 years of solitude hadn't lightened the weight of his memories, not those of his family, nor of his time in uniform. My father say, Nia continued, her voice taking on the cadence of recitation, guilt like stone in river. Can move around it, but it still change how water flow. She handed the letter back to Jake. Cannot undo past, can only choose now. Something shifted between them in that moment, a deeper understanding, a recognition of shared burdens. They were both survivors, carrying the weight of those they'd lost, both seeking some form of redemption neither believed possible. Outside, Scout suddenly barked sharply, then fell silent, his warning signal. Jake doused the lamp immediately, moving to the window. In the moonlight, he could make out riders on the ridge, too distant to identify, but watching the cabin with obvious intent. Burke's men, Nia said quietly beside him. They watch, wait for you to leave, or sleep heavy. Jake checked his rifle automatically. We need to be ready. They'll come soon. Nia nodded, her face resolute in the darkness. We fight together now, not just for me, for truth about Burke. For your redemption, too. Her words named what Jake hadn't admitted to himself, that in protecting her, he was seeking something beyond mere defiance of men like Burke. He was reaching for the man he might have been, had loss and guilt not carved him hollow. Together, he agreed, the word a promise and a challenge all at once. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Jake demonstrated the proper way to load his Winchester repeating rifle. Nia watched intently, her eyes following every movement of his hands. When he offered her the weapon, she took it with practiced ease that surprised him. You've handled rifles before, he observed. Some Apache scouts use army guns, she explained, checking the sights with a familiarity that spoke of previous experience. My cousin teach me when soldiers not looking. Jake corrected her stance slightly, impressed by how quickly she adapted. Aim for center, he instructed. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger. By midday, Nia was hitting targets at 50 yards with reasonable accuracy. Not expert marksmanship, but enough to make Burke's men think twice about rushing the cabin. Jake found himself appreciating her quick mind and determination, qualities that reminded him, uncomfortably, of Sarah. In return, Nia taught Jake Apache methods of moving silently through brush, identifying edible plants, and creating diversions using natural materials. She showed him how to crush certain leaves to mask human scent when tracking or being tracked. Make sound there, she explained, demonstrating how to throw a small stone to create noise away from one's position. Enemy, look wrong direction. You move here. Her hands sketched the flanking movement in the air. They worked throughout the day, fortifying the cabin and outbuildings. Jake dug a narrow trench from the back door to the barn, providing covered access if they needed to reach the horses quickly. Nia created hidden caches of water, food, and ammunition at strategic points around the property. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a spring storm. Jake glanced at the sky with concern. Need to check the line shack, he told Nia. Storm's coming, and we might need it as a fallback position. The line shack stood 3 miles east, a simple one-room structure Jake had built for shelter during bad weather when working the far pastures. It also contained emergency supplies, food, ammunition, and medical items that might prove vital if they were forced to abandon the cabin. Nia insisted on accompanying him rather than remaining alone at the ranch. They rode double on Jake's mare, Nia's slight weight barely noticeable behind his. Scout ranged ahead, alert for any sign of Burke's men. The storm caught them halfway to the line shack. Rain lashed down in sudden sheets, driven by gusting wind. By the time they reached the small structure, both were soaked to the skin. Jake hurried Nia inside, then quickly unsaddled and sheltered his horse in the lean-to at the back. The interior of the shack was Spartan, but dry. A small iron stove, a narrow cot, shelves stocked with canned goods and supplies. Jake lit the lantern hanging from the center beam, then busied himself starting a fire in the stove while Nia inventoried the supplies. "Good," she said, examining the ammunition stores. "Enough for long fight." Jake glanced at her, noting the practical way she assessed their resources. Not panicking, not wasting energy on fear, just preparing methodically for what was coming. "Storm might last hours," Jake said, listening to the rain hammering the tin roof. "We should wait it out here." Nia nodded, wringing water from her long black hair. The small space felt suddenly intimate as they worked around each other, hanging wet clothes near the stove, sharing the room's only blanket. And as night fell and the storm intensified, they sat side by side on the cot, the lantern turned low to conserve oil. Thunder crashed overhead, lightning illuminating the shack in brief, stark flashes. "In my tribe," Nia said, her voice barely audible above the storm, "we say thunder is ancestors' voices, warning or blessing." "My mother called it angels bowling in heaven," Jake replied, surprising himself with the memory. "She'd tell us that when storms frightened us as children." Nia smiled faintly. Different words, same comfort. Another crash of thunder rattled the windows. In its aftermath, the space between them seemed charged with something beyond the electricity in the air. When Nia reached out to check a leak developing near the window, her arm brushed against Jake's. Neither pulled away immediately. "Your shoulder better?" she asked, noticing he hadn't rubbed it all day despite the damp weather. "Your medicine worked," he admitted. "First time in years it hasn't ached before a storm." "Let me see," she said, motioning for him to remove his shirt. Jake hesitated, then complied, uncomfortably aware that it had been 3 years since anyone had seen him this exposed, this vulnerable. Nia's fingers traced the old bullet wound professionally at first, testing for heat or swelling. But something in her touch changed, became less clinical and more something else. Their eyes met in the lantern light. For a moment, neither moved. Then Nia's hand slid from his shoulder to his face, fingers light against his bearded cheek. "Been long time," she said softly. "For both." The kiss, when it came, was tentative, questioning, each giving the other every chance to pull away. Neither did. Instead, the contact deepened. Years of isolation and loss momentarily bridged by this unexpected connection. Later, as they lay together in the narrow cot, the storm gradually subsiding outside, Jake felt something shift inside him, some wall crumbling that he'd spent years carefully maintaining. He'd told himself he was content in his solitude, that the emptiness was preferable to the pain of attachment. Now, with Nia's head resting against his chest, her breathing steady in sleep, he recognized the lie he'd been telling himself. Dawn broke clear and golden. They rode back to the ranch in a companionable silence, each processing the night's unexpected turn. As they crested the final rise overlooking the cabin, Jake reined in sharply. Scout growled low in his throat. "Someone's been there," he said quietly, pointing to fresh hoofprints in the mud around the cabin. The door stood slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered latching it before they left. "Burke," Nia whispered, tension returning to her body. They approached cautiously, Jake with rifle ready. Inside, the cabin had been thoroughly searched, drawers emptied, his trunk upended, floorboards pried up in spots. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the violation of his space hit Jake like a physical blow. "They look for map," Nia said, checking that her medicine pouch was still secure at her waist. "And for us." Jake nodded grimly, surveying the damage. "They know we're preparing. This was a warning, showing they can get to us any time." The implications were clear. Burke wasn't just watching anymore. He was making his move. The siege had begun. As Jake righted an overturned chair, the sound of an approaching horse made them both freeze. He motioned Nia toward the back room, grabbing his rifle, but the familiar voice calling his name made him relax slightly. "Jake, you there?" Thomas Blackwood's weathered face appeared in the doorway, concern etched into the lines around his eyes. "Thank God," he said when he saw Jake. "Thought I might be too late." "What's happened?" Jake asked, noting the older man's agitation. Thomas removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Burke's gathered more men, at least 15 by my count. They're camped at Cottonwood Creek, but they're saddling up." His voice grew grave. "They've got official-looking papers, Jake, claiming authority to arrest Apache fugitives and anyone harboring them." "Papers can be forged," Jake said, though he felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. "That's not all," Thomas continued. "They caught me watching their camp, roughed me up some before I got away." For the first time, Jake noticed the bruise darkening on Thomas's cheekbone. "Burke said to tell you he's coming at noon, said to give up the woman and the map, or he'll burn you out." Nia had emerged from the back room, her face composed despite the dire news. "We fight," she said simply. Thomas looked between them, reading the resolve in both their faces. "I figured you'd say that. That's why I stopped by the Wilkins place on my way here. Nathan's gathering some of the other ranchers, ones who've had run-ins with Burke before. They might come, might not." He shrugged. "But I sent a rider to find your uncle, too," he added, nodding to Nia. "Nashota, right? He and his band were spotted near Apache Pass last week." Nia's eyes widened slightly. "You know my uncle?" "Fought alongside him in '67, when we were both scouts for the Army," Thomas said. "Before things went bad between our peoples. He's a good man." Jake checked the position of the sun. They had perhaps 3 hours before Burke arrived. "We need to prepare," he said. "Thomas, can you ride to your place, bring back that shotgun, and whatever ammunition you've got?" The older man nodded. "I'll be back within the hour." As Thomas rode away, Jake turned to Nia. Their eyes met in silent communication, both understanding that the stakes had risen dramatically. Whatever happened when Burke arrived, there would be no going back to the way things were before. "No regrets," Nia said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "You choose this path. I choose too." Jake nodded, touched by her certainty even as his own doubts gnawed at him. He'd been a soldier once, had seen battle, but that had been different. Armies facing armies, uniform against uniform. This was his home, and the enemy was men who claimed to represent the very government he'd once served. "We'll be ready," he said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. Dawn broke blood red over the eastern mountains. Jake stood on the porch, watching the sun rise with a soldier's eye. Clear skies meant good visibility, no cover of weather for either side. Thomas had returned last night with his promised weapons and had stayed, the three of them taking shifts to watch through the night. Now, as morning light spread across the land, Jake assessed their preparations with grim satisfaction. Following Nia's suggestions, they had created multiple defensive positions around the property. Escape routes were established, supplies cached at strategic points. The horses were saddled and hidden in the brush behind the barn, ready for a quick departure if necessary. "Riders coming," Thomas called from his position at the upstairs window. "From the south." Jake moved quickly inside, where Nia was checking the ammunition one final time. Her face was composed, showing none of the fear he knew she must feel. "Remember the plan," he said quietly. "If things go wrong, you take the north trail through the ravine. Don't wait for us." Nia met his eyes steadily. "We fight together. We leave together." Before Jake could argue, Thomas appeared at the top of the ladder that led to the cabin's small loft. 15 men, heavily armed. Burke's leading them. Jake took a deep breath, centering himself as he had before battle in the war. "Thomas, take position in the barn. Nia, the south blind we prepared. I'll meet them out front." Thomas clapped Jake briefly on the shoulder before heading out the back door, moving in a low crouch toward the barn. Nia paused before following, her dark eyes finding Jake's. "Be careful," she said simply. Then, unexpectedly, she pressed something into his hand, a small carved figure from her medicine pouch. "Protection." Jake nodded, tucking the token into his shirt pocket. No words seemed adequate for what might be their final moments together. Instead, he touched her cheek briefly, then gestured for her to go. Alone in the cabin, Jake checked his weapons one last time, rifle loaded, revolvers at his hips, knife in his boot. Scout whined softly at his feet. "Stay," he ordered the dog. "Protect Nia." The dog seemed to understand, trotting out the back door toward Nia's position. Jake stepped onto the porch just as Burke and his men reached the edge of the clearing. They fanned out in a semicircle, maintaining a cautious distance. Burke urged his horse forward a few paces. "Callahan," he called, "last chance to be reasonable. Send out the Apache woman and whatever she's carrying. You can walk away from this." Jake stood his ground, rifle held casually but ready. "No one here by that description, Burke. This is private property. I suggest you move on." A cruel smile spread across Burke's face. "Private property, is it? Funny thing about property rights in the territory. They depend on who's enforcing them." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I have here authorization to apprehend dangerous fugitives by any means necessary." Signed by the territorial governor himself. Jake recognized the lie. He'd seen enough official documents in his army days to know Burke's papers were likely forgeries, but it wouldn't matter to Burke's men who believed they were acting with authority. "I've got no quarrel with your men, Burke," Jake called. "Just with you. Why don't we settle this between us?" Several of Burke's riders exchanged uncertain glances, but Burke laughed harshly. "Nice try, Callahan, but I didn't come all this way for a fair fight." He turned to his men. "Burn him out. $500 to the man who brings me the Apache woman alive." The first shots came suddenly, 2 riders firing at the cabin while others moved toward the barn. Jake dropped to a crouch, returning fire methodically. From the barn, Thomas's shotgun boomed, dropping one of the approaching men. From somewhere to the south, Nia's rifle cracked in a steady rhythm, forcing several riders to seek cover. Burke bellowed orders, clearly surprised by the organized resistance. "Circle around back. Find the woman." Jake smiled grimly. Burke had expected a lone rancher, easily intimidated. Instead, he'd found a coordinated defense with multiple firing positions, making his superior numbers less effective. For nearly an hour, the battle continued in brief, intense exchanges of gunfire. Jake moved between positions, creating the impression of more defenders. Nia used the techniques she'd shown him, throwing stones to distract and confuse Burke's men about her location. Then the tide began to turn. One of Burke's men managed to reach the barn with a torch. Dry wood caught quickly, flames leaping up the side of the structure. Thomas emerged, firing both barrels of his shotgun before a bullet caught him in the leg. He fell, crawling toward the cover of the water trough. "Thomas!" Jake shouted, breaking cover to run toward his friend. A bullet whined past his ear. Another kicked up dust at his feet. Nia appeared from nowhere, providing covering fire as Jake dragged Thomas behind the trough. The older man's face was gray with pain, blood soaking his trouser leg. "Just a scratch," Thomas gasped unconvincingly. Jake quickly bound the wound with a strip torn from his shirt. "Stay down," he ordered, then turned to Nia. "We need to fall back to the cabin." She nodded, firing one more shot before they began their retreat, half carrying Thomas between them. They had nearly reached the cabin when Jake felt a searing pain across his side, a bullet grazing his ribs. He stumbled, nearly dropping Thomas. Nia's strength surprised him as she took more of Thomas's weight, dragging both men the final yards to the cabin. Once inside, she barricaded the door while Jake positioned Thomas behind the overturned table. "How bad?" she asked, looking at Jake's bloody shirt. "Just a graze," he replied, though the pain suggested otherwise. "Keep firing from the windows. Make them think we're still strong." The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching skyward. Several of Burke's men had taken position behind the corral, maintaining steady fire at the cabin. Others were circling toward the back. "They'll try to burn us out next," Jake said grimly, checking his ammunition. He had perhaps 20 rounds left for the rifle, another 12 for each revolver. Not enough. A crash from the back room confirmed his fears. Something flaming had been thrown through the window. Nia rushed to extinguish it, stomping out the flames with a blanket, but another followed, and another. Smoke began to fill the cabin. Thomas coughed weakly from his position behind the table. Outside, Burke's voice called mockingly through the chaos. "Nowhere to run, Callahan! Send her out or burn with her!" Jake met Nia's eyes across the smoky room. In that moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that they might not survive, but they would face whatever came together. The decision made, Jake moved to the back window, firing at the men attempting to approach with more torches. Nia did the same at the front, her shots carefully placed and effective. The crack of a rifle from somewhere beyond the cabin perimeter dropped one of Burke's men, then another. A war cry echoed across the clearing, distinctly Apache. "Nashota," Nia whispered, hope flaring in her eyes. "My uncle." From the ridge to the east, a dozen riders appeared. Apache warriors interspersed with white men Jake recognized as neighboring ranchers. Thomas's plea for help had been answered. Burke's men, caught by surprise and suddenly under fire from multiple directions, began to fall back in disarray. Jake saw Burke himself retreating toward the cover of the trees, shouting for his men to regroup. Jake and Nia seized the moment, bursting from the cabin with Thomas supported between them. They made for the horses, hidden behind the burning barn, using the smoke for cover. They had almost reached the horses when Burke emerged from the smoke directly in their path, revolver aimed at Jake's chest. "Going somewhere?" he snarled, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "It's over, Burke," Jake said evenly, keeping his body between Burke and Nia. "Your men are running. Papers are forged. There's nothing left for you here." "Nothing left?" Burke laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "I've lost everything because of her and that damned map. My position, my reputation." His eyes narrowed. "If I'm finished, so are you." Everything happened at once. Burke's finger tightened on the trigger. Jake lunged forward. Naya shouted a warning. A shot rang out. Jake felt the impact of Burke's bullet like a hammer blow to his shoulder, spinning him backward. Through a haze of pain, he saw Naya launch herself at Burke, knocking his arm upward as he fired again. The bullet went wild. Jake staggered to his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Burke and Nia struggled for control of the revolver, a deadly dance in the smoke-filled air. With his remaining strength, Jake threw himself into the fray, tackling Burke to the ground. The three of them rolled in the dirt, Burke fighting with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. His hand found the knife at his belt, blade flashing in the firelight. Jake caught his wrist, straining to keep the blade from his throat. Naya struck Burke across the temple with a rock, momentarily stunning him. His grip on the knife faltered. In the confusion of the struggle, the blade turned inward. Burke's eyes widened in shock as his own knife sank into his chest. "No!" he gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Not like this." Jake pulled Nia away from the dying man, both of them breathing heavily, covered in soot and blood. Around them, the sounds of fighting had diminished as Burke's remaining men fled or surrendered to Nashota's warriors. Thomas had managed to drag himself to the horses. He sat leaning against a tree, his injured leg stretched out before him, shotgun across his lap. "Took your time," he remarked dryly as Jake and Nia approached, supporting each other. Despite everything, the pain, the smoke, the nearness of death, Jake found himself laughing. It was a rusty sound, unfamiliar after so many years, but genuine. Nia joined him, her laughter like music against the backdrop of crackling flames. Nashota approached on horseback, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the scene. His eyes softened slightly at the sight of Nia, alive and standing tall despite her injuries. "Uncle," she said in Apache, then switched to English for Jake's benefit. "You came." Nashota nodded once. "The Old One's message found us. We rode through the night." His gaze shifted to Jake, assessing. "You fought well for a white man." Jake inclined his head, recognizing both the compliment and its limits. "Your niece taught me a few things." A ghost of a smile touched Nashota's lips. She always was a difficult student. Perhaps she needed a difficult teacher. As the adrenaline of battle faded, Jake became acutely aware of his wounds. His shoulder burned where Burke's bullet had struck, and his side throbbed from the earlier graze. Beside him, Nia swayed slightly, her own injuries and exhaustion taking their toll. Nashota gestured to his warriors, who moved to help the wounded. "Come, we make camp by the creek, tend wounds, then we talk of what comes next." Jake looked back at his cabin, smoke damaged but still standing, and the smoldering ruins of his barn. The ranch he'd built as a refuge from the world had become a battlefield, its isolation forever broken. Yet as Nia's hand found his, fingers intertwining, he realized he no longer needed that isolation. Something new had taken root amidst the ashes of his old life. "Yes," he agreed, turning toward the future that awaited them. What comes next? 1 month after Burke's attack, Jake stood on the newly rebuilt porch of his cabin, surveying the changes to his land. The barn had been reconstructed, its fresh-cut timber still pale against the weathered walls of the cabin. To the east, where empty pasture had stretched before, a small cluster of Apache dwellings now stood, 5 conical structures that housed Nia's extended family who had chosen to remain. His shoulder still ached where Burke's bullet had torn through muscle, but the wound was healing well under Nia's care. Her knowledge of medicinal plants had likely saved both him and Thomas from fever and infection. The official investigation into Burke's actions had moved with surprising speed, thanks in part to documents found among his possessions, records of his embezzlement from government supplies meant for San Carlos. The territorial authorities had been eager to distance themselves from Burke's unauthorized operation, especially once several prominent ranchers testified about his threats and forgeries. Jake heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Nia emerging from the cabin. The past month had changed her as well. The constant wariness in her eyes had eased, replaced by a quiet confidence. She wore a dress of traditional Apache design, but made from cloth Thomas had brought from town, a blending of her worlds that suited her. "Thomas is coming," she said, pointing to the distant figure approaching on horseback. "Brings news, I think." Jake nodded, appreciating how her English had improved through their constant conversations. His own Apache vocabulary had grown as well, though he mangled the pronunciation enough to make Nia's younger cousins giggle. Thomas reached the cabin and dismounted with care, his injured leg still stiff. "Morning," he called cheerfully. "Brought the mail and supplies." Over coffee at the kitchen table, Thomas shared the news from town. Judge finally ruled on Burke's men. Most are being released. Seems they genuinely believe they were acting under official orders. 2 of the ringleaders are facing prison time, though. Jake wasn't surprised. He'd argued against harsh punishment for the men who'd been misled by Burke's lies. Enough blood had been shed. "What about the reservation situation?" he asked. Thomas's expression grew more serious. "That's actually why I came. The Indian Affairs Commissioner is investigating conditions at San Carlos after what happened. There's talk of allowing some bands to return to traditional territories." He nodded toward Nia. "Your uncle's testimony about Burke's corruption carried weight. They're establishing a new sub-agency near Apache Pass, and they've asked Nashota to help administer it." Nia's eyes widened. "My people go home?" "Some of them," Thomas clarified. "Those willing to register and maintain peace. It's not freedom like before, but it's better than San Carlos." Hope and skepticism warred in Nia's expression. She'd heard too many broken promises to fully trust government intentions. "There's more," Thomas continued, pulling a letter from his pocket. "This came for you, Nia, from Fort Apache." Nia took the letter carefully, though she couldn't read the English words. She looked to Jake, who gently took it from her hands and read aloud. It says, "They've located a young Apache man named Keem at the Northern Agency. He matches the description of your brother and has been asking about a sister named Nia." Tears welled in Nia's eyes, the first Jake had seen her shed. "He lives," she whispered. "Keemy lives." Jake continued reading. "They can arrange a supervised reunion at Fort Apache next month, if you're willing to travel there under escort." "We go," Nia said immediately, looking to Jake for confirmation. "When snow melts from Mountain Pass, we find Keem." Jake nodded, already calculating what they would need for the journey north. The "we" in her statement settled comfortably between them, no longer questioned by either. After Thomas departed, Jake and Nia walked to the small rise behind the cabin where a young cottonwood had been planted. Beneath it lay a cairn of smooth river stones, a memorial Jake had created in the Apache tradition under Nia's guidance. From his pocket, Jake withdrew the silver pendant that had belonged to Sarah. He'd carried it all these years, unable to part with it, but equally unable to look at it without pain. Now he knelt and carefully buried it among the stones. "They would have liked you," he said quietly to Nia. "Sarah was strong like you, never backed down when she believed in something." Nia placed her hand on his shoulder, understanding in her silence. She had performed her own ceremony here days earlier, honoring her father and others lost at San Carlos. "My father say spirit's not gone," she told him. "Just walk different path now, sometimes beside us, sometimes ahead to show way." Jake rose, taking her hand in his. On the breeze, he caught the scent of cooking fires from the Apache encampment, heard the laughter of children playing near the creek. Sounds that would have seemed foreign and intrusive months ago now felt right, as if his land had been waiting for this infusion of life. In the distance, several Apache women worked alongside Jake's nearest neighbor, Nathan Wilkins, learning to tend cattle in exchange for teaching his wife their weaving techniques. What had begun as temporary sanctuary was evolving into something neither culture had quite seen before, not assimilation, but coexistence. "What happens after we find Kimi?" Jake asked, the question that had lingered between them finally voiced. Nia's expression grew thoughtful. "He is young, needs family, needs home." Her eyes met Jake's directly. "This place could be home for all who seek peace." "A bridge between worlds," Jake said, echoing words Nia had used before. She nodded. "My people need safe place. Not reservation, not running. Place to be Apache with dignity. Your people need to learn not all whites bring destruction." Her hand tightened around his. "We teach both." The vision she described was ambitious, perhaps impossible. The territory was changing rapidly, more settlers arriving each month, tensions still high between cultures with vastly different views of the land and its purpose. What they proposed would face resistance from both sides. And yet, looking at what they'd already built from the ashes of conflict, Jake found himself believing it might be possible. If not for the entire territory, then at least here, on this small piece of Arizona that had once been his lonely refuge. "It won't be easy," he warned. Nia's smile held both wisdom and challenge. "When easy thing ever worth doing?" As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they made their way back to the cabin hand in hand. Scout ran ahead of them, pausing occasionally to ensure they followed. Inside, Jake added wood to the fire while Nia prepared their evening meal, moving around each other with the comfortable familiarity of shared space and purpose. On the table lay maps of the territory, marked with the route they would take to Fort Apache when the mountain passes cleared. Beside them, Nia had placed her medicine pouch, now containing not only the precious map to the food caches, but also a small carved horse Jake had made for her from cottonwood. Their physical wounds were healing. The deeper ones would take longer, but had begun the process. Jake no longer woke every night reaching for his rifle, and Nia's nightmares of San Carlos had grown less frequent. They were learning to carry their pasts without being crushed by them, to honor what was lost while building what could be. Later, as they stood on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky, Nia taught Jake an Apache blessing for new beginnings. The words felt strange on his tongue, but right in his heart, a prayer to whatever forces governed the universe that what they'd found together might endure. "Home is not place," Nia said softly, echoing something she'd told him weeks earlier. "Home is where hearts find peace together." Jake nodded, finally understanding. "Two paths," he said, repeating her words from their first days together. "One journey." Around them, the land stretched away in all directions, not empty as he'd once perceived it, but full of possibility. Beyond the mountains lay uncertainty, the world with all its complexities and conflicts. But here, in this moment, Jake Callahan, once isolated by grief and guilt, stood, with his hand intertwined with Nia's, no longer alone, no longer adrift. Together, they watched the last light fade from the western sky, not an ending, but a beginning. The first day of whatever future they would forge in this harsh but beautiful land that had brought them together against all odds. In the vast landscapes of our most difficult moments, we often build walls rather than bridges, convinced that isolation will protect us from further pain. Yet it is precisely through connecting with others, especially those whose experiences differ from our own, that true healing begins. This story reminds us that redemption rarely comes in solitude. Instead, it emerges in the courageous choice to help another, to extend ourselves beyond comfortable boundaries, to risk vulnerability after loss, has taught us to guard our hearts. The wilderness between cultures, between wounded souls, may seem insurmountable. But when crossed with courage and compassion, these seemingly barren spaces can become fertile ground for understanding and growth. Our deepest wounds, when shared rather than hidden, often reveal the path toward wholeness. Perhaps home is not a place at all, but rather that sacred space where differences are not merely tolerated, but valued, where two distinct paths converge into a single journey of mutual respect and shared purpose. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Arizona Territory. If you enjoyed this story of healing across cultural divides, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and follow the channel for more tales that explore the resilience of the human spirit.